All right, so let's work down the line here. I'm just going to actually hand the mic down and let you each introduce yourselves by name, tell us a little bit about the business you're currently with, and then we'll dive right into questions. And because I don't have any slides here today, if those of you who love to use Twitter and want to be part of this conversation, I prepped up a little hack on my own Twitter account, which is @JenniferZick. I'm sorry, I never introduced myself. I'm Jennifer Zick, founder of Authentic Brand. So if you visit my Twitter page, the top post is going to lead you to every one of their handles and the event hashtag as well. So let's take it away. I'll start with you, Chip.
Thanks, Jennifer. My name is Chip Pearson. I'm a co-founder and chairman of Jamf, local enterprise software company focused on building solutions for the Apple ecosystem.
Carson, Kipfer, co-founder and principal designer at SportsEngine, youth sports software, specifically in the youth and amateur realm.
Phil Soren, I'm currently the executive chair of Flipgrid, which is a video collaboration tool. Pulled out of the University of Minnesota, was the founder and CEO of two startups way decades ago, Zyotech and Compelling.
Hi, I'm Clay Collins. I'm co-founder of Leadpages, which also is Drip now, and I'm also on board, and I guess the board chairman.
And I'm Pete Ceballos. I'm the CMO at SPS Commerce. We're a cloud-based supply chain platform, 100% focused on retailing, and we're what's making it easy for you to buy anything, anytime, and get it shipped to you instantly. But we're helping to reinvent retailing.
Awesome. Pete, you can hold on to that microphone there, and we'll just swing it around, all right? We're going to share this morning. How's the audio? Can you hear us in the back? You can hear us. Okay, good.
You better we can hear them.
All right, because I'm a theater girl, so I project. I'm going to invite you all to project and sing into the microphone, gentlemen. Okay, so with these 5 tech leaders, we can take this conversation in about a million directions, but you're all here today because the focus of this conversation is around brand, storytelling, what goes into being a startup. And what we're going to try to do in our time together today is extract lessons learned from the tech industry and apply those to any industry. So we hope to make this conversation relevant to all of you, wherever you are in your entrepreneurial journey and whatever industry you represent. So let's dive in. So I'm going to just lob this question out there, and whoever picks it up first, I'm going to pass the mic around. So let's start with the topic at hand, branding a startup. I love branding. I mean, that's part of what I do. But at what point in starting up a business does the branding portion start to become important? And then how and where do you get started with that?
So I think branding is kind of like culture. Like you have one whether or not you've deliberately created it. So we got started, without a logo. We didn't put out some fancy document. We didn't print out some 1-800 number and try and seem like we were bigger than we were. We were just kind of authentic from the beginning. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs and startup founders get really caught up in their head when it comes to branding at first. And the advice I give people, especially around a logo, which people can just go nuts over. They're going to asking their friends and their parents, and everyone has an opinion, and what does their boyfriend or girlfriend think? And what I say to people is Google's logo is a font, Facebook's logo is a font, Time Magazine's logo is a font, New York Times logo is a font. Just pick out your favorite font. Hopefully it's not Papyrus or whatever, and take a picture of it and just move on at first, right? Start with a business of actually getting customers and doing what you're going to do, and then from there, your brand at first is just going to be you. So at the beginning, I blogged a lot, and I responded to every single tweet. I responded to every single blog comment. I responded to anything the market threw at me, and I think that was the brand, was that we were responsive, and we put your needs above, some posturing that we were going to try and do to the market around, faking it until you make it. And I think that really served us well, and it allowed us to sort of from day one be really true to ourselves, as opposed to believing that in order to be successful, we had to pretend that we were something that we weren't, and that worked out well for us.
I love that story, and the word authentic in particular. Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to build on what Clay was saying, because I think this idea of brand and culture and values are kind of inseparable. And I think really early on, knowing like why you're in business and what you're doing it for, that is, I mean, I couldn't reiterate anything Clay said more emphatically, except to add values to it as well. Because if you're in business and you're getting back to people, and that becomes who you are. And if you don't, that's also who you are. So I'd say, you know, especially in the early days, we were maniacal about many of the same things. We were very interested in the success of other people before success for ourselves. And that was something that it was just my partner and I talked about regularly. Hey, you know, if we take care of them, they'll take care of us. But if we take care of us, nobody will take care of us. You know, and so that, I think those values are an important place to start. And then the thing about font and logo, that all comes later. That's identity system, that, you know, how your actions then are represented through symbology. So I think a lot of people get caught up on what that is versus focusing on the actions that are important.
I think that's spot on. Just to build on that, I think a lot of people when they start businesses start pretending like the startup ecosystem is their customer. So a lot of people who started businesses around the time that I did and my co-founder did, instead of getting a customer, they were going to participate in some startup pitch thing. Or instead of getting another customer, they were going to meet with some investor. Or instead of getting another customer, they were going to do some contest. Or instead of getting another customer, they do some hand-wavy thing. And they were very interested in what the startup ecosystem thought of them. They were not that concerned with what their customers thought of them. And I think that really, really hurt them. And I think that prevents progress. I would be obsessed with your customers. I would not give a flip about what the startup ecosystem thinks of you.
It's interesting, I kind of came to this panel thinking I'd be different, but actually, I say that. If you get too tied up in this corporate marketing stuff, it can really kill you early on. So I was just going to jump on what you said about the customer focus right away. So we did something compelling where we actually branded this, but we call it the C3. And so we're doing data storage, so it took a while to build the product. So a year before we had a product, we pulled potential customers in. I thought we'd have 8 or 10 of them kind of help us out, and we ended up having 35 of them do it. They wanted to be part of it. You know, they'd heard about us before, so they wanted to be part of our startup. But they also wanted to live vicariously and be an entrepreneur without having the paycheck go away. And those people would meet every 8 weeks with us, and they helped us build this product. And so we were focused on, guess what? They were our first references. They were our first some customers. Probably a third of them never became customers. They couldn't. They were at Wells Fargo. They couldn't get on the certified list or whatever. But they really helped us. When we announced the product, they stood up and announced the product. We didn't. So this whole thing of getting focused on the customer first versus all this pretty fluff stuff, I think is really important. And use those people for a long, long time. They ended up having their own logo. They had their own T-shirts. They felt like they were in a special club. That's worth branding.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think about a mark or a visual identity when they talk about brand. And those are things that you can do to encourage others' perception of your business, but that perception is actually what it's all about. It's what your customers are saying to each other about you. And depending on your scenario, you need to just think about how you can help them tell that story. What are those connections you're making with them to provide value? And ultimately, the way that they think about you, the way that they talk to their friends and their family, I mean, that's your brand right there.
Carson, hold that mic because I'm going to sling another one right back at you. All right. So I think you guys have all spoken to some of the misconceptions around what brand means, particularly for a startup. And as I work with small businesses, I often have a conversation about, the branding doesn't start with the logo, it starts with what the story is, and the story is all the things that you're talking about. But a lot of businesses, especially in those early years of growth and startup, get so focused on the product or the service they're developing that their story ends up being a commodity message. It's product, it's services, it's about us, right? It's what I call the what message rather than the so what message and how that matters to the buyer, right? And Carson, I think SportsEngine has done an amazing job of knowing their so what message from the start. Could you share with us kind of how that was born and then how you fostered that? And then I'd like to hear from the rest of you.
Yeah, sure. So for us, I mean, we were fortunate. It was really natural. Justin, my co-founder, and I both played youth sports growing up, and that was the world that we knew. And so from day one, we were just pulling on our own experiences, all of the positive things that the world of youth sports gives kids as they're growing up. You know, it's these great experiences where it teaches you about teamwork and community, teaches you about setting goals and achieving goals, about learning how to win and learning how to lose, and you know, life isn't always fair. You know, you're not always going to get the call. And so that was the thing that motivated us, is we really understood the value there, and we thought that this level of technology could just enable those volunteers and parents who are actually making those things happen, make their job a little bit easier, a little bit more enjoyable. And so, I mean, that was our message from day one, and that's the reason we're there, still doing it today.
And as the parent of 2 hockey players, I want to say thank you, SportsEngine. You have made my life better. Truly centralized it. Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on the so what messaging and how to keep your focus there as you build products and services?
Yeah, I think you need to be courageous enough to be ambitious and to name your ambition. I think a lot of people get started and they're afraid to actually be bold and think about how could I fundamentally transform the status quo for the customers I'm trying to serve. So I've been in 3 startups that went from nothing to public, and the same thing at SPS Commerce today. You have to be bold. You know, when we talk to our customers, we talk about how are we going to fundamentally reinvent how you do business today. But unless you are bold at the beginning, and there's been a lot written about in the venture business, people that raise money talk about a future that's 5 years away, that in reality turns out to be 15. But if they couldn't convince you of the 5 years, they never would have gotten the money to make the 15 possible. And when you're starting a company, be bold, be courageous, and really be imaginative about how you can transform somebody's life, their business. Going back to what we were talking about with brand, be obsessed with your customers, but be bold at the outset.
I love that, Peter. Spoken like a true visionary, and I think this panel represents a lot of visionary leadership. So how do you, as a visionary and a leader, articulate and make that vision tangible to the people working on your team? And how do you keep the vision alive? You know, how are you creating as a leader the headspace, the time, the environment to nurture that vision and to articulate it? There's so many questions in there. Pick whichever one. Talk to me about, as a visionary, how do you make that tangible and how do you share that internally in your organization?
All right, so I think that having a defined mission, vision, and values, you know, for us it was a lot of overhead, and we didn't spend a lot of time on it, but we'd spend a lot of time talking about what was important with customers. And I think that conversation needs to happen regularly in kind of a structured way. So when somebody would come into the organization, we put them through 2 weeks of new employee training. It used to be 4, including your departmental time. And so we'd hire people that already had skills, but they got nothing but really kind of values and capabilities and goals of the organization for the first week, and then product capability in the second week. And so that idea that we're going to talk a lot about like why these things matter. And what ended up happening was we got to a spot where the org was getting big enough that a lot of that organic style of person to person wasn't working. We needed to formalize it. But I think a lot of times people do that mission, vision, value stuff as like a day one kind of thing. I think start with values and, you know, understand where you're going, but some of that's going to change as you go along. And what we ended up doing was actually going out and talking to about 400 of our employees at that point in small group sessions and saying, what do you guys see? What do you guys hear? What have we told you? What has stuck and resonated? And then we were able to formalize in a way that was very aligned with what we understood from the organization too. So I'd say that over time, that stuff, I mean, you've got to have the picture, you've got to be able to articulate it, and writing it down and codifying it, I think maybe happens a little bit later than people want to do because they haven't tested their theses in a lot of different areas yet to really know where they're at. It's like starting out, you know, when I was in 3rd grade, I wanted to be a doctor like every other 3rd grader. I ended up doing something different by the time I got to my adult job. But, you know, so it's one of those things too. And I think businesses in a lot of ways are like that same journey we go through as we grow up. That's my point of view.
So I'm going to push back a little bit on Chip here on this. This thing. I've always found a lot of these mission, vision, values on the front door or whatever, no one can repeat it. I mean, it has all the right words, and you fight over this word, that word. You need to have values, you need to have mission, you need to have culture, that kind of stuff. But I've always found those in general don't work. So, but what we did is we branded our culture, and we called it positive aggressive. You know, I did a TED talk on it, but I knew it was working when employees were coming to me saying, I'm trying to make my personal life positive aggressive too. So it wasn't just me making them memorize the word positive aggressive, they actually changed how they did it. So I think it has to be something that they can feel, they can repeat in English, they could repeat to their spouse at dinner that night or whatever. And I think there's some tactful things you can do to start reinforcing that. So early on, I interviewed everybody. When you have 1,200 employees, you can't do that anymore. So you have to put some new techniques in there. You have lunches with all of them, that kind of stuff. But we did things like on the first Friday you worked at the company, you had to give the corporate pitch to, at first it was me, and then later on your VP or whatever. So it was a scary event for the receptionist to do the corporate pitch, right? And it's interesting, you learn a lot about your employees, number one. Two, they feel like they've earned their way into the club a little bit. I mean, they start acting different because they're confident now, right? And the third thing was wild is the worst presentations were from the salespeople. They thought they could wing it, they could, come in, that kind of stuff. We only fired one person after the presentation, but it was a salesperson that was trying to wing it, and it was obviously not going to be part of the culture and some of that. So I just say brand your culture and know what it kind of feels like, and don't get too hung up on the right adjective in front of the noun. So that.
And I want to say, I absolutely agree with Phil too, and pushing back on me. For us, we ended up getting to because we hated that stuff that we would see at other companies.
Yeah.
And for us, it was like, and we have two, it's selflessness and relentless self-improvement, right? And so right, like something simple like that versus 5 bullet points or sentences long, and because nobody could remember them. And we went through that exercise. So I absolutely, what Phil was saying, we kept it super simple.
I just want to iterate that as well. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, again, just like logo, just like branding, just like anything else, can get really caught up in their heads. And I think the more work you have to do to come up with this stuff at the beginning, that is correlated to how hard your customers and your employees are going to have to work to try and remember it, right? If it rolls off the tongue, if it's obvious, if it's natural, if it's organic, if it's authentic, then it's going to be easy to tell that story, and it's going to be easy for everyone to fill. I think that people can get they can take themselves way too seriously when it comes to mission, right? Like at Leadpages, yes, we were trying to help small businesses. Yes, there are people who can't pay their bills and maybe would like to take a vacation or need to hire someone in their small business so that they can be with their kids. But that story can get really dramatic. I think at the end of the day, we wanted people to have fun with their marketing. We want people to really enjoy the process of growing a business just like we enjoyed that process. And it's okay for your mission to just be like, this usually sucks, we want to make it fun, right? You don't have to get to some point where everything is about like saving the world or some big, existential thing. I think it's okay to have fun. I think it's okay to keep it simple. I think it's okay to build a company because you all just really enjoy making cool shit, and that's good enough at the end of the day.
There are a couple themes. Peter, you can grab the mic too.
Yeah, this is really interesting as we talk about this because culture, mission, vision, values, all of that has to map directly back to how do you behave every day in business. And as leaders, are you demonstrating the behavior that you say your values represent? And I've told a bunch of people this a lot, but there's an awesome video of Jeff Weiner being interviewed by Reid Hoffman about how LinkedIn, when they had 100 employees, very intentionally decided to define their culture because they anticipated being a multinational company someday, and they understood that they needed to have a cohesive, intentional culture if they were going to have the same LinkedIn office around the world. But it's an awesome interview with Jeff Weiner about how LinkedIn did this. We did this 2 years ago at SPS Commerce. We did an all-employee survey 2 years ago, And we got incredible high marks on our culture, our mission, their belief in our strategy. And when the management team was looking at these results, we're like, this is kind of funny because we've never written any of this down. Like, we don't have a written mission, vision, or values. We haven't written down for our employees what our strategy is. But we're behaving in such a way that they believe it all. So it was easy for us to get to an explicit mission, vision, and values because we realized we were living it every single day. So when you wrote it down, people were able to understand, oh, I see that happening, I believe that. But you really have to live it every day for it to be authentic and for it to be part of your company.
So I'm going to go out and say it's really important to document your values and write them down. So this is from our experience, and wholeheartedly the value in them lies in the way that you live them every day, in the way that people see that. So internally, I mean, that is your culture. It's not what's written down, but it's the way that people just act to each other in the way that you make decisions. Where we found value in documenting our core values is attracting talent. So we're able to put that out there as our guidepost and say, this is what we believe in, this is what's important to us. And the people that align with that and value those same things, that's really attractive to them. So it kind of acts as this layer to say, if these are things you believe in and you find important, we want you to come be a part of what we're doing. So we found a lot of value in that documentation, more from a recruiting standpoint, and trying to find people that fit with the way that we think and the way that we do business.
The one thing I'd add on this values and mission, that kind of stuff there, if there's only one or two personalities in the company that are dominant, and they better fit those values or whatever, because under the pressure of a startup or whatever, all your personality traits are going to get magnified, both your positive ones and your negative ones. So if you want to save the world, but you really don't care about the world, it's going to show real quick, and it's going to be a fake value. So make sure it fits those two dominant personalities, or don't do it, because it'll look inauthentic later on. So.
Yeah, wise words. I have one more question that probes a little bit into this related topic, and then I want to pivot into some other strategies and topics related to growth and what it really looks like on the inside. All right, so the last question in this space is that usually, and we've already heard this coming through your stories, usually the initial vision, the hypothesis of the business, the story originates with the founders. But then as you grow, there comes a time when the story needs to be told by others within the organization. Phil, I love what you shared about everybody giving the pitch and what you shared about onboarding. How in that growth, where in that growth stage did that happen? Where like the story needs to be really owned and embedded by others in the organization? And then how do you, as your company grows and you've got a marketing department that's creating content, telling your story, how do you preserve that integrity of your story? What goes into that process?
So I think too many founders at the beginning, or too many CEOs at the beginning, not the end, spend not enough time actually externally facing. There's a lot of company meetings, and we're going to get together as a company and talk about what the company believes. But I think that the best set of values emerge often when a founder or a CEO is spending a lot of time talking to the customers, when the company can observe how they talk to the customers into the market. So I think tools like being on podcasts. What happens when the media interviews you? What happens when you publish content to your blog and people outside the company or people inside the company can observe how people outside the company are seeing you talk? Those things say a lot and become part of the internal culture as well. I think it's in a lot of cases at the beginning, not at the end. It's a lot easier to build a culture by doing a lot of PR and a lot of external storytelling and then seeing how that reverberates internally. It's a good way to practice and sort of ossify your myths, your origin story, right? Like when you think about a superhero, right? A superhero has a superpower, they have a fatal flaw, and they have an origin story. How did they come to be, right? And those are kind of good places to start with when you think about telling your brand story. What can you do better than anyone else? What is your fatal flaw? And how did you come to be? Why are you who you are?
I think there's some good stuff in that. That was really good. Our fable was that we started in the basement in Eden Prairie, right? In Silicon Valley, you start in the garage. In Minnesota, you die if you're in the garage. It's too cold, right? So you lean into the north, as opposed to, lean back. But one thing I just wanted to jump on what he said there is, I just tell entrepreneurs, spend 4 times more effort on how you're going to sell your product, distribute it, talk to customers, because you tend to go right to your product, your technology, your internal stuff. You're going to force yourself to look at your calendar and spend 4x of the creativity, the time, the effort on external stuff. And especially a lot of entrepreneurs are more techy, so they tend to be more into the technology and stuff. So I really challenge you there if you want to be successful.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really important that we came to realize is when you start out, it's a little chaotic and you maybe don't feel like you really know how to run the business. It's very natural to go find the expert who's done it before. And I think it's a catch-22. Like, those people can be incredibly valuable if they fit your culture. But one of the things that we found is when we haven't hired for values, we've always had challenges. When we've tried to trade a little bit of values for a little bit of experience, we end up usually with an experience that reinforces our values. That's awesome. I'm going to hang on to that. But it is. I mean, because what ends up happening then is the culture starts to drift, and the story starts to drift towards the expert's other experiences and not experiences inside. And so for us, one of the things that we realized was, I will take somebody who aligns with our values, who's very inexperienced, and teach them the skills they need, because that's easier than teaching somebody with skills the values they didn't come through the door with. There are very few things that teach values after adolescence. And I'd say the only thing that I've gone through in my life where I've actually adopted values that were different was the military and boot camp, and they're set up to do that specifically. But otherwise, in adult life, I think it's really hard to have a values shift through employment. So hire for values and train skills versus hiring for skills and trying to get somebody on board with the values.
I've got something. I really believe this very strongly, so I'm going to have another thing to say here. Hopefully I'm not dominating too much. I believe that when it comes to cultures and values, the most fundamental question you can address is, are you going to be an externally facing culture or an internally facing culture? Are you going to be an externally facing brand, or are you going to be an internally facing brand? And I think when a company first gets started, it's really easy to hey, I'm talking to my co-founder all the time. What do we think? Oh, is there consensus here? What do you think? And everyone's like, well, what do you think of this product idea? I like it. Let me talk. And that's just a bad pattern to set up from day one. I think if you can visualize a good culture, it's a circle, kind of like a team might stand in a circle, but everyone is facing outwards, not inwards. And I think as a company grows, the chasm between inside the building and outside the building just magnifies. So when you're first starting, everyone's answering support tickets, everyone's talking to customers, hopefully, everyone's sort of reading what the press and stuff. But as you get bigger, the internal culture can take on a life of its own. And if that internal culture is not facing outwards, looking at customers, looking at the market, looking at what people are saying, not just looking at what your customers are saying, but looking at what leads are saying. And not just looking at what leads are saying, but looking at what people who have never even heard of your company have said. So if you think about this as a series of concentric circles, it's very easy to know what you think, right? You're like, I'm going to check in with myself. What do I think about this issue? It's a little bit harder, but still pretty easy to know what your team thinks about a given issue. Hey, we're all huddled. What do we all think? All right, we have consensus. We're going to go to this person and say we want to do this because we all think it's the way it should be done. All right. So it's harder, but still pretty easy to know maybe what you think as a company, right? And then, so we're sort of going outside of there. It's still doable for most people in the company to know what the customer thinks, right? You can go over to support. Maybe you can work on some support tickets. You still have to be disciplined about doing that. it becomes a lot harder to know what leads are thinking, right? People who are somewhat aware of your company but haven't bought yet. And unless people are going to conferences, unless you're, staying on top of what's happening in your market, it is really hard to know what's happening in the general market. And I think you can become this very internally referenced, kind of dogmatic, siloed, just screwed up culture if it's all about, internal consensus versus being maniacal about what's happening outside the building. And I think that's where most companies go wrong. And I think, frankly, that's where most Minnesota companies go wrong. We care so much about what our coworkers think, but we should always, always value more what the customer thinks and what the market thinks more than what our coworker thinks, because our coworker can absolutely be wrong, right? If I'm going to choose between my coworker and the market always wins. And there's only one person or one group that can fire everyone, and it's not the CEO, it's the customer, and it's the market. The market can fire you all day long, and they can fire everyone in the company.
Yeah, I mean, so that was exactly what I was going to touch on, as well as just the importance of that. I think, so we're looking at this in the lens of startup week. And so as you're a startup, those types of customer interactions happen really naturally, and they happen very frequently. But as you grow, you need to be very cognizant of putting things in place, a structure in place that enables other people in the organization to connect with your customers. And at scale, that becomes incredibly difficult, especially if you have like an engineering staff that's just in the building writing code. I mean, if you can find a way to get them interacting with a customer or on site, seeing how the software is being used and actually experiencing those problems for themselves, that type of motivation and understanding will propel them and motivate them. It's just worth its weight. Well, just one example, but as you build a business, think about how you can just put things in place that make it possible for your team to get out and interact with customers.
Those are such great points, you guys, and thank you for sharing those. And I've seen the same thing happen as a marketer for growth companies. When we were small, I could tell every customer story because I was managing that project. I sold it, I managed it, I thought through, and I could write those customer success stories. But as our team grew, and I was leading a marketing department, and I was not as client-facing, the stories became less real to me, right? And the content became less meaningful. And I see a lot of companies that grow, and pretty soon the marketing department is like sitting in an ivory tower somewhere in corporate, and they never have ever met with a customer, right? And so I think that's the fatal flaw that organizations, even in startup mode, set themselves up for in the beginning, and they, without building the systems and the processes to keep team members of all departments client-facing and client-engaged.
Yeah, or so a new person joins the marketing team and they're like, tell me who our customer is. I want you to show me the persona. And they're looking for this, sanitized abstraction of the customer in a persona. And it's like, well, we can show you the persona, but how about you go talk to 100 of them? Talk to one a day until you can actually finish their sentences for them. And then you can tell me if you think this persona's right,
Right. I see a hand in the back, and we are going to try to leave some time for questions at the end. Is there something you want to shout out?
How do you guys disseminate failure with your customers and the brand, right?
Oh, failure is on the agenda this morning.
But
Nice segue.
we get a really hard time when we have failure. We're like, hey, you'll know why it failed. How do you disseminate that to your culture?
Good question. The way we had that framed up on the agenda today is how can you turn failure into a success metric? How do you fold that into your story and make it stronger?
So I didn't try to disseminate failure to my customers, but I tried to disseminate it within the company. Where one of the things we did really, really well at Compellant, I mean, it's not like you're patting yourself on the back, but you can only brand so many things. One of the things we branded was our support group, and we actually call it co-pilot. And when I interviewed the co-pilots, I told them, you're now in the cockpit with that customer, and if he can't land, you're dead too. And you do whatever it takes to make that happen. They shipped equipment. It could be very expensive decisions that a co-pilot, which is usually the lowest rung on the corporate ladder, can make those decisions. Well, pretty soon those co-pilots started getting the respect of engineering, And guess what? All their failures quickly got to engineering because the co-pilot was there on Saturday night at 2 a.m. working with the customer or whatever. So we elevated them enough where they had a voice in the company and they disseminated the failures and stuff. Now you can amplify it as a CEO or whatever, but you have to have a culture where that is, you know, allowed and permissible. And they had to earn the respect of the engineers, that they were, you know, technical enough to handle most things, but sometimes it was the code needs to be fixed, and you know, the engineer needs to be in here on 2 a.m. too with the co-pilot. So I think it's a little bit more of the culture of, does everyone feel empowered or not to take advantage of it?
Yeah, I think organizationally and individually, I think too oftentimes people who are new to starting a company think that if something's going wrong, they're doing it wrong. And that's the way things go, right? I mean, that's where you learn. And the real conceit is to like have a problem occurring and not address it and not be open about it. And what did we learn? Because the org needs to learn those things too. So if we have a mistake, we would talk about it openly with the company, because it was important for the individuals to see executives or leadership teams make mistakes too. And we can recover from those things, and we need to learn from them. And I think the danger too often is we don't talk about mistakes. We bury them, we don't learn from them, so we repeat them. And they all live underneath the rug like a lumpy little surface that we're trying to navigate around and not trip one. So I think it's super important when we make mistakes, we own it, you know, we apologize and we fix it. And then we learn from it and don't make it going forward. The problem that I run into is when people repeatedly make the same mistakes, and that's usually where you've got something you've got to address. But you know, it's, you know, and I run into so many people who are afraid to admit their shortcomings, or afraid to admit where they're not strong. And they stay weak in those areas. But the strongest people, the most resilient people that I've worked with are the ones who say, man, I really screwed this up. Can I talk to you about how do we fix this, where I could have done something different? And I'll solicit that all the way down to customer service reps, you know, too. And that same people, like Phil's talking about the co-pilots, I singing from the chorus over here.
We had a line, this is my line, that you want more fingerprints on the gun, not fewer. So this is more true in sales than support. But, if you're losing a deal, most sales teams try to get insular and not have anybody know about the opportunity because they know they're losing. I always said, no, bring me in at the last minute. I might lose too, but put more fingerprints on the gun. And that's a cultural thing, right? But it's pretty visual and people get it. But maybe not as good now with all the happenings in the world. But.
One sec, Clay. Okay, I want to give Peter a chance. Did you have it?
Yeah, I just, so between startups and here, I had two partners, and we ran a venture capital firm for 7 years, from 2004 to 2010, which was a horrible time to raise a second venture capital fund. And we couldn't, but so there was a failure there. But you know, we'd listen to 300 pitches a year, and we'd fund 2. And we crawl through, just with incredible detail, their operating plans and look at, you know, what are your 3-year projections for everything. And failure is data when you're running a startup. And the only thing, when we talked to the CEOs that were trying to raise money, the only thing we knew in those 3-year operating plans that we all sweated so much over was every single number's wrong. You have no idea what your revenue is going to be in 2 years and 2 quarters. But your plan is the container for all the assumptions you've got about your business. And you need to sweat those details to know when you're actually trying to build the business and start collecting data. Failure is a way to tell you, boy, that assumption we had about this is wrong. And now we need to recalculate. So to me personally, like, failure is just data. And when you're doing a startup company, you don't know anything really until you get into the market. And to the points that were made earlier, if you're not listening to your customers, you're just going to go off the rails. But you know, we coined a phrase at the firm I was at about bad news has to travel faster than good news.
Yeah.
You know, everybody is always happy to share the good news, but if you don't get to the bad news fast, you can't figure out what went wrong. You can't go fix it. But I think you need to build a culture where you look at failure like data, and you're just collecting data to make better decisions with.
I think that's exactly right. So I just transitioned to board chairman from CEO. Super thrilled that we got John Tedesco as our CEO of Leadpages. But I've taken a lot of time to kind of reflect. I've got like 5 years of processing, you know, 12 to 10 hour work days, 10 to 12 hour work days, and I'm like kind of waking up after, you know, this fog of not getting enough sleep. And I think one thing that I wish I had done is share more of the failures. I think when you're an entrepreneur, you develop like this you know, you're so optimistic about so many things, right? It's said of Larry Ellison that he doesn't have a line problem, he has a tense problem. And I think that I wish from day one with Leadpages, we would have shared the company dashboard, everything, the metrics, leads, sales, losses, churn, everything from day one. And I think when that happens, it empowers people, it gives them a real sense of what's happening in the business, and I think it's frankly a good thing. Netflix, there's a really good podcast called Seeking Wisdom where they interview the head of culture at Netflix named Patty McCord, and she talks about the first time that they had to do massive layoffs at Netflix, and essentially everyone knew they were coming, because they were all looking at the numbers every single day, and it wasn't a surprise. People knew what was about to happen, and they knew that X, Y, and Z wasn't working. They knew that they were spending too much money on their servers, and that they'd have to maybe move to the cloud. Like, everything's out there in the open, and I think that's probably the best way to deal with failure, is not to create these discrete points where you have to stand in front of the company and deliver bad news. It's to have, you know, this stream of transparency that everyone can consume on a daily basis.
I think there's a lot of value in holding retrospectives, and so by that, you're putting time aside at the end of whether it's a project or a huge failure to actually talk about it as a group. It gives you an opportunity to dig into the details. You can talk about the things that maybe there were some things that went great. Maybe there were some other things that went horribly, horribly wrong. But in that space, if you give yourself that space, that's where you can actually learn from those things. And I think just that discipline of taking the time to actually examine a failure, that's where you're going to get the value from it. Instead of just kind of cruising past it and maybe making a little mental note, if you actually give it tangible time, that's where you're going to find your organization gets better and you as an individual grow quite a bit as well.
Well, surprise, surprise, we're not going to make it through our entire list of questions. We knew we wouldn't. This is such great content. There's one more big question I want to ask, and I want to hear from each of you on this, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes to take some questions, and we can always keep the conversation going through a little mix and mingle after the fact too. There's another event starting here at 9:15, by the way, as part of the Startup Week lineup, so welcome all of you to stay for that as well. So this last question, we're talking about failure right now, and kind of at the micro level, projects lost and deals lost or failures within the organization. But let's be real, guys. You're all up here because you represent incredible success, right? We're all looking at you saying we want to be like you when we grow up, right? You've set great examples and you've led brands that are not just successful by the numbers, but they are stories in this local market that we talk about behind your backs because we admire them, right? You've created something that people look at and admire. So you've made success look easy to us, but we know it's not. I know there's war stories that go on behind the doors of your organization. So what would you share with us? What would you say to those in the crowd today who, like me, are starting something new and are somewhere between moments of ecstatic, joy and panic attack? What would you say about the road ahead? What advice would you give? What really has to happen to make it happen? I'm just going to go down the line here.
Wow. I was gonna wait for everybody else to talk and then agree with them. But I think that it's so personal and so different for so many different people. Like, the obstacles that you're going to face are going to be unique to you, and I think that the willingness to put the time in and the effort to overcome what your obstacles are. We talked about the fatal flaw of your superhero self. That's going to be different for every one of us. And having the courage, I'd say kind of twofold, having the courage to know when you've got to take it on and invest the time and get through it, but then also, maybe this was just your first idea. right? And I think a lot of people will really fall in love with their idea, and you might be getting signals from the market that despite all of your effort and all the things that your vision of this future may not be agreed upon by the people that are purchasing it. And at a certain point, having the courage to face that too and realize this was just your first idea. It doesn't have to be your last idea.
So I had a professor in college, so I went to school for graphic design, and it was this little Asian lady named Bao, who was one of the most influential professors at UW Eau Claire. And as a designer, you get up and you show your work. So you'd be going through doing a design project, and that would go through iterations, and you'd have to put your work up, and people would critique it, and the Ying would come by and tell you everything that was wrong with your design, and encourage you to maybe explore some different solutions. But she always ended that critique saying, keep going. So that simple term of just keep going. And especially in the design world, it's not about keep going necessarily on the wrong things, but it's keep going in iteration and keep pushing it. And I feel like as an entrepreneur, there's so many very dark and challenging times. And just to keep going, right? And push through that. You're going to get to a point where you have clarity or a different concept, and that really can push you to the next level.
So we're up here because we won some victories and stuff. I would tell you, before my biggest victories, I had a failure before it. So I never tell you about those stories, right? So just realize that as you sit in the audience there. I would just tell you, as you go through this process, it's really hard. If it's easy, everybody do it. But you need to celebrate micro victories. And as a leader, you're the only one that can do that. You got to find little things that went right and make sure people know about it, because it's always daunting what's ahead of you, because you're always growing into unknown territory. So find ways to celebrate micro victories, and I call it rolling thunder. It's amazing when people start seeing what worked somewhere else, they tend to do it with what they're doing. So don't forget those micro victories, and it doesn't mean you have to have a big long email newsletter to do it too. So.
On this front, my advice would be to just not start a business unless you can't not do it, right? It seems sometimes like there's an entire ecosystem that's trying to convince everyone to become an entrepreneur and start a startup and go to this class and talk to this person and just, keep on going. But sometimes keep on going doesn't mean that you need to continue to do a startup, or that you should start one in the first place. I think I was born an entrepreneur. Not everyone who is a successful entrepreneur believes that they were born an entrepreneur. But at every single step of the way, I didn't keep going because I looked in the mirror and hyped myself up and got my friends to say nice things to me. I did it because it was the only thing I could do. There was no other way for me. There was no out. I didn't even have to burn the ships. There were no ships. This is just fundamentally who I am. And I recently stepped down as CEO from Leadpages, and I started another company, and I thought I was going to take 6 months off. I really did, genuinely, truly. I thought I was going to take 6 months off, and 6 to 8 weeks later, I had started something else, because there is no other way for me. And I think that at the end of the day, this is way too hard for someone to do this if you have an out, or if there's something else you might rather be doing. If you're doing it because this space is amusing to you, because you think you have good ideas, because you think there's an opportunity that's untapped, and sort of it's more of an opportunistic thing than something that in your bones you have to do, then I just wouldn't do it. I really wouldn't. So I guess that's my final word is, don't do it unless you can't not do it. It's got to be the only way, or nothing at all.
Yeah, building on that, 2 things. I've got a brother and 2 sisters, and my oldest sister worked at the National Park Service, and my brother and my other sister both work at Boeing. One's an accountant and one's an engineer. And I went straight out of college into a startup. I was the 83rd employee at a startup that eventually had 7,000 employees. my definition of acceptable risk just horrifies my siblings. Like, they're just so used to stability and predictability. And then when you look at startups, you know, you're building these smooth growth curves of revenue that just goes up and to the right, you know, and profit that does the same thing. And you work really hard to make those curves look like that. The horror show underneath those curves never changes. Like, it's a struggle to get a company off the ground. It's a struggle to get it to be cash flow positive. Once it's cash flow positive, it's a struggle to get it to $100 million. It's a struggle to get it to $1 billion. The only thing that's changing is the size of the unknowns get bigger. You know, the amount of surprise and what you have to do to go and adjust to that gets bigger. But you're always in this continuum of all of your plans are constantly being disrupted by something you didn't expect. There's an awesome book about this by Ben Horowitz called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And it's a great insider's view of what does it take to build a technology company in face of, you know, surprise after surprise. But get into this if you love the fact that you don't know what's going to happen next, and you love the fact that you need to build a business with a nice smooth growth curve up and to the right.
Gentlemen, this has been absolutely fantastic. You're authentic, just so open, transparent, honest, and straight to the point. Stories and input are just, I know, very highly valued by our attendees here today. We really have very little time for questions, and I thought this might be the case. We could spend a half a day up here, a whole day. We could turn this into a conference, and there would still be good value to unpack. But let's take maybe 2 questions from the audience, first with hands up. Go.
I just wanted to say that the thing I hear from all you guys is that you do it yourself. You don't tell your employees to do things unless you do it yourself. So that's really a common thread I'm hearing, and I can respect that because I would never tell my staff to do something I wouldn't personally do as well. So that's great.
Thanks for that
Sorry,
feedback.
not really a question.
No, good feedback though. All right, hand in the back.
You guys are talking about sharing successes and failures with the employees of the company. How transparent can you get? I know sometimes, you guys can handle that up and down and then the pressure knowing what's happening, but a lot of employees, they don't know how to access that. How do you guys handle that?
There's 2 things that we won't talk about, and that's comp or HR issues, right? Like, those are the 2 things for us that are off limits. Otherwise, pretty much, at least historically, that's everything else is kind of open.
One thing I'd caution you to be careful of, you always have to put the lens of you're sitting in the other seat first. So I'll give you an example. Anytime I have to do a layoff or something like that, don't put what the company impact in. Start with the impact to each individual employee, because they can't hear you until they know what happens to them. So you need to think about what's the effect on that individual before you share every news, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I would say that I would share information with your employees as a mechanism for people to self-select out of the business who aren't made for the realities of that business. So like, is it Zappo, the shoe company, pays people, I think it's like a couple months' salary after they've been there for, this is kind of spurious, either a week or a month, they'll pay them to leave, right? And it allows people to self-select out of something that they don't want to be a part of. And I think that if you want employees that are durable, that can that are built for the realities of the market you're in and the stage of the business you're at, I'd say figure out what you want there and share accordingly. I would lean into sharing more rather than less, and let people just opt out. If they don't want to be there, if they're scared about turmoil or whatever, that's great. Maybe you don't want people there who aren't who are super risk averse. Maybe that's the most honest thing to do.
One more question? Any other questions? Vernon? If not, will you please join me in thanking our panelists for their